For the fourth time in 4 years, the Indianapolis Colts will have a new starting quarterback. Let's break down the fantasy football impact of the Carson Wentz trade from Philadelphia to Indianapolis with SI fantasy football analysts Michael Fabiano and Ben Heisler. Fabs, let me go to you first. Let's talk about the Colts. Do you think they got an upgrade at quarterback with Carson Wentz under center? And what does this do for their playmakers on your fantasy rankings?
Well, it's good news, right? And I think this is the best case scenario for Carson Wentz, who goes and will reunite with Frank Reich. Remember, Frank Reich was the offensive coordinator in Philadelphia in 2017 when Carson Wentz had his best season and his best fantasy season. He was potentially a league MVP that year before injuring his knee against the LA Rams and ultimately missing the rest of that season. He has not been good lately, though. Let's put it that way, right? But if you go back and look at Carson Wentz's numbers, he had the big season 2017, was very productive. The following year, he played 11 games, averaged almost 18 points per game. And in 2019, played a full season, and he finished 10th in fantasy points among quarterbacks. Now, things went sideways this past season. I get it. Now, in Indianapolis, he's got a fresh start. He's reunited, as I mentioned, with Frank Reich. He's got some good young talent, too. Jonathan Taylor in the backfield, Naheem Hines. This is good news for Michael Pittman Jr. and maybe even Paris Campbell if he can ever actually get on the field because he's been so prone to injuries. And I feel like from a fantasy perspective, this is all good for the Colts and their offensive skill position players. They have a good offensive line. And to me, the alternative was what? Signing Jameis Winston, playing Jacob Eason. I mean, neither one of those alternatives would have been very good, at least for me. So Wentz going into Indianapolis, I think he is going to be a QB2, likely to be drafted late. But now I feel a little bit more confident in those pass catchers around him with the Colts.
Ben, let me ask you because the Chicago Bears were also being linked to Carson Wentz or to trading to Carson Wentz. What does this do now for the teams that may still be looking for a quarterback?
And they're very much in place. I mean, you mentioned the Chicago Bears. Wentz and the Colts are, that was sort of the opportunity that the Bears were trying to figure out what to do. Ultimately, the Colts presented a better offer. And frankly, the Bears are in a bit of salary cap hell. They weren't necessarily willing to trade with a first round pick. And I actually give Ryan Pace a bit of credit for hanging on to that first round pick, even though it's a conditional first rounder over the course of next year. But the Bears need a veteran. They need somebody to try and figure out what can be next. I would imagine maybe Ryan Fitzpatrick or Alex Smith could be in play for them as they're just trying to get to that next level to drafting another quarterback in the future. Other teams that need quarterbacks, certainly Jacksonville in the mix, the New York Jets, they're likely to go through the route of the NFL draft. You have the Washington football team after Alex Smith and Taylor Heineke. There's really not much there. And then the 49ers. I know that Jimmy Garoppolo still remains on their roster. And still a lot of people would consider him to be a decent fit in Kyle Shanahan's offense. But I think they're looking to go big. And don't be surprised if Mitchell Trubisky ends up with the San Francisco 49ers via free agency. That's actually somebody that Kyle Shanahan might be able to groom a little bit of a low risk, high opportunistic signing for them. As far as teams like Houston and the Eagles, with Jalen Hurts, the Seahawks with Russell Wilson, could they be potentially considering a different quarterback if any of these guys get moved? I suppose so, but I'm just not ready to put them in the mix just yet because they currently remain on the roster.
Fabs, Ben just brought up Jalen Hurts and the Eagles. You're a fan of Hurts for fantasy football purposes.
Dude, I dig him the most. I love Jalen Hurts. When he came out of college, I'm thinking, oh, this guy could be a fantasy star. Then he ended up in Philadelphia, and I'm like, oh, man, this is not a great fit because Carson Wentz is there, and he's young still, and the contract and everything. It all worked out, right? The fantasy gods, they smiled down upon us in this scenario. He played 3 games last year where he actually started and finished. He averaged over 25 fantasy points per game. He rushed for an average of almost 80 yards per game. Now, I'm not expecting Jalen Hurts to score 25 points per game, all right? Let's not get things twisted here. But can he give you right around 20 points per game based on what he can do with his arm, but more importantly with his feet? Absolutely. And the Eagles have Jalen Reagor. They have Dallas Goedert. I think they're going to add potentially some new young talent on the offensive side of the football. Maybe they'll get one of the top 2 wide receivers in the 2021 draft class, right? Jamar Chase, Devonta Smith. There is some real possibility here that the Philadelphia Eagles offense is going to be very fantasy friendly in 2021. And it will be held by Jalen Hurts, who, if I went into any of my fantasy football leagues next season with Jalen Hurts as my QB1 guys, I'd be absolutely thrilled with it. And that comes from a Dallas Cowboys fan.
Because of this trade, I think a lot of links will be made between the Eagles and the Colts. Right now, the Colts, they are the favorites to win the AFC South. The Eagles are the biggest dark horse to win the NFC East in terms of MVP odds. Carson Wentz, 30-1 now that he's a member of the Indianapolis Colts. Jalen Hurts, meanwhile, 100-1 to win MVP, according to DraftKings Sportsbook. Fabs, Ben, great stuff as always. Plenty more fantasy football coverage. There's no off season when it comes to fantasy football, especially here at Sports Illustrated. So check out all of our fantasy coverage at si.com/fantasy.